Well, there we are. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I don't recall if this was from earlier, but Ashley Raven 1998, I think you followed during Bioshock, but thank you very much for the follow. Just in case I didn't catch you, I don't have notifications when people follow while I'm playing on PlayStation, unfortunately. So, yeah, that was 3 hours ago, so that was most likely during Bioshock. Anyway, that was fun, guys. I enjoyed Destiny a lot. I like playing with X-Wing and Bane. Good times. Always good to play with friends. And for those of you who have not added me on PlayStation or Steam or any of that stuff, my PS4 ID is the same as your GameLifeGame, as is my Steam ID. My my GOG ID is weirdly Captain Reroll. That was a random one from a long time ago that for some reason I signed up for with that, but hey, whatever. And thank you, Vane, for not killing everything and making Joe and I look completely awful at that game. So, we finished The Hobbit last night. Bilbo has returned home with his treasure and has bid adieu to Thorin Oakenshield, who paid for his foolishness with his life eventually. But Bilbo's got the ring, and I'm sure we'll return to that at some point. Fellowship of the Ring, which I've actually organized some books that I plan on reading soon. So, we have Fellowship of the Ring all ready to go. I have a really old copy of the trilogy somewhere from like the 60s, but it's most likely boxed up. This is a newer version that I bought to reread. But the next book we're going to be reading is the first book that I read, the first fantasy book that I read that probably wasn't off my dad's bookshelf that I chose for myself. And that's going to be Pawn of the Prophecy by David Eddings, which you can see right there on my screen already. I lent this to a girlfriend in high school, and she returned it to me like this, which is very sad because I love my books and I don't like when people ruin stuff. Oddly enough, she loved the series, and I turned her on to Eddings. But if you are not familiar with Eddings, he's a little bit of a... These days he would be in the young adult category, I guess. Although, hey, people... Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, well, The Hobbit especially, as a children's book, and I would say that's a little ambitious these days. But, yeah, this is a book I probably read first in like 4th or 5th grade. Do I actually have my... I wrote a lot of my name in the grade in a lot of those books back then, but I didn't write it in this one for whatever reason. I believe it came out in '84. Maybe earlier than that. Let's see. And I know a lot of people these days aren't familiar with these, but Dr. Madnar, I agree with you. This is one of my favorite series of all time. This is one of the few series I've reread besides the Lord of the Rings trilogy multiple times. And it's probably been a good 10 or 15 years since I've read it, so... 1982, so I would have been 9 years old when I read this. And Mr. Eddings has sadly passed on, but it's a pretty good series, so hopefully you guys enjoy it. I'm gonna read this for about an hour, probably, and then, hey! Dr. Madnar, thank you so much for the subscription, sir. I really appreciate that. Welcome to the Dragon Army. I forgot what that notification was. It happens so rarely, and everybody keeps sneaking in their subs when I'm off stream. But I really appreciate that, man. Thank you for the support, and welcome to the Dragon Army. That means a lot, man. So, thank you very much. I guess Eddings put you over the edge. So, thank you. That's really cool. Every little bit helps us get where we're trying to go. So. You are the 7th subscriber to the GameLifeGame channel, and still in the top 10. You guys are awesome. So, yeah, light it up in the chat. Go use we don't have our own emote yet, guys, but let's use those curse lit for Dr. Madnar in the chat, please, for that subscription. I'm gonna give you some of my own. But yeah. I've been looking forward to it. Once I started reading, I knew right away, I was like, this is what I was going to want to do at some point, so I figured sooner is better than later. Get into one of my favorite series of all time, and we'll have a good time with it. If I can find this emote I want to use, Dr. Madnar, I'm going to light it up for you. Boom. Thank you, Vane. Hopefully our emotes will be on board soon. I don't know how long it takes. It seems like it's taking most people about 3 or 4 days to get approval, so hopefully we get approved and we're good to go. I don't see why we wouldn't get approved. Joe did a really good job on them, so. Well, welcome to the Dragon Army, sir. And, that's about that. So I guess I should stop talking and start reading. The Tamuli, yeah, I forgot. I was, what's your, oh man, I'm friends with you on PlayStation. I can't think of what your name is. But, is it related to an Eddings book? I wasn't paying that much attention to it when I accepted the friend request, but... But yeah, I've read this, series probably at least 10 times. And, Xandermas, oh nice! That's great. We won't spoil anything for anybody for, if we ever... I'm sure we'll get to those. I'm sure I'm gonna read through all the Eddings, in due time, so... really having fun with the reading on stream, actually, so I hope you guys are enjoying it. And, yeah, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, if I can just get comfortable. I seem to have an issue this morning with where my man bits are sitting. Not sure what's up with that, but we will get into Pawn of the Prophecy by David Eddings. And I'll read the dedication. For Theon, who told me stories, but could not stay for mine. Kind of sad. And for Arthur, who showed me the way to become a man, and who shows me still. It's very nice. So. I thought about posting this. I really ought to put up a, these old maps. Not that you can really get a good read on that. And you can look it up if you like, to see what the map is inside the book. You don't have to know where it is, but they do travel quite a lot, and it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of geography. Something I will consider doing going forward. Map cam, exactly. We could probably do that instead of the event list when we do games. Let me just see real quick if there's one I can throw up there. I'm sure there is. Well, that is not it at all. Are you serious? That's a hard thing to Google, apparently. Let's try a different Google search. Is that the whole thing? Well, yes it is. Maps in these old fantasy novels are one of my favorite things, so kind of miss when games used to come with all the cloth maps and stuff, so alright. I'll put that down there. This is the first book in a series of 5 called The Belgariad that takes us through the entire story of the main character. and his friends. So, it's here somewhere. I swear it is. There it is. No, that's not even what I just saved. Really? Change the bump? There we go. That's better. I clicked on the wrong one because I'm smart. Should have thought of this ahead of time, but hey. You guys are here for a reading stream, so you don't need constant excitement. Yeah, let's just do this. Yeah, it's not going to size right, is it? Yeah, we'll just kind of put it down here in the corner. I hate to hide the box art, though. We did that. I could size this down a little bit. There we go. Alright, there's room for everything now. Everybody's happy. Well, I'm happy. I don't know if you're happy, but map cam indeed. So, without further ado, we will do Mr. Eddings the honor of reading Pawn of the Prophecy. We'll begin with the prologue, being a history of the War of the Gods and the acts of Belgarath the Sorcerer, adapted from the Book of Alorn. Now, this is written in a style of like the Silmarillion from Tolkien. Not the entire book, just the prologue. The prologue is like an ancient history lesson to give you background before what comes next. When I was first reading this, I skipped it because it seemed very thick writing to me. Now it doesn't obviously do that, but I didn't know what I was missing out on until about 3 or 4 years later when I read it again in 8th or 9th grade. So, anyway, prologue. When the world was new, and the 7 gods dwelt in harmony, and the races of man were as one people, Valar, the youngest of the gods, was beloved by the Alorns. He abode with them and cherished them, and they prospered in his care. The other gods also gathered peoples about them, and each god cherished his own people. But Valar's eldest brother Aldur was god over no people. He dwelt apart from men and gods until the day that a vagrant child sought him out. Aldur accepted the child as his disciple and called him Belgarath. Belgarath learned the secret of the will and the word and became a sorcerer. In the years that followed, others also sought out the solitary god. They joined in the brotherhood to learn at the feet of Aldur, and time did not touch them. Now it happened that Aldur took up a stone in the shape of a globe no larger than the heart of a child, and he turned the stone in his hand until it became a living soul. The power of the living jewel, which men called the Orb of Aldur, was very great, and Aldur worked wonders with it. Of all the gods, Torak was the most beautiful, and his people were called the Angaraks. They burned sacrifices before him, calling him Lord of Lords, and Torak found the smell of sacrifice and the words of adoration sweet. The day came, however, when he heard of the Orb of Aldur, and from that moment he knew no peace. Finally, in a dissembling guise, he went to Aldur. "My brother," he said, "it is not fitting that thou should absent thyself from our company and council. Put aside this jewel which hath seduced thy mind from our fellowship." Aldur looked into his brother's soul and rebuked him. "Why dost thou seek lordship and dominion, Torak? Is not Angarak enough for thee? Do not in thy pride seek to possess the orb, lest it slay thee." Great was Torak's shame at the words of Aldur, and he raised his hand and smote his brother. Taking the jewel, he fled. The other gods besought Torak to return the orb, but he would not. Then the races of man rose up and came against the hosts of Angarak and made war on them. The wars of the gods and men raged across the land until, near the high places of Corum, Torak raised the orb and forced its will to join with his to split the earth asunder. The mountains were cast down and the sea came in, but Balar and Aldor joined their wills and set limits upon the sea. The races of man, however, were separated one from the others, and the gods also. Now when Torak raised the living orb against the earth, its mother, it awoke and began to glow with holy flame. The face of Torak was seared by blue fire. In pain he cast down the mountains. In anguish he cracked open the earth. In agony he let in the sea. His left hand flared and burned to ashes. The flesh on the left side of his face melted like wax, and his left eye boiled in its socket. With a great cry he cast himself into the sea to quench the burning, but his anguish was without end. When Torak rose from the water, his right side was still fair, but his left was burned and scarred hideously by the fire of the orb. In endless pain, he led his people away to the east, where they built the great city on the plains of Meloria, which they called Cathal Mishrak, City of Night, for Torak hid his maiming in darkness. The Angaraks raised an iron tower for their god and placed the orb in an iron cask in the topmost chamber. Often Torak stood before the cask, then fled weeping, lest his yearning to look on the orb overpower him, and he perish utterly. The centuries rolled past in the lands of the Angarak, and they came to call their maimed god Kal Torak, both king and god. Balar had taken the Alorns to the north. Of all men, they were the most hardy and warlike, and Balar put eternal hatred for Angarak in their hearts. With cruel swords and axes, they ranged the north, even to the fields of eternal ice, seeking a way to their ancient enemies. Thus it was, until the time when Cherek Bareshoulders, greatest king of the Alorns, traveled to the Vale of Aldor and to seek out Belgarath the sorcerer. "The way to the north is open," he said. "The signs and the auguries are propitious. I hate that word. Now is the time ripe for us to discover the way to the City of Night and regain the orb from One Eye." Poledra, wife of Belgarath, was great with child, and he was reluctant to leave her. But Cherek prevailed. They stole away one night to join Cherek's sons, Draz Bullneck, Algar Fleetfoot, and Riva Irongrip. Cruel winter gripped the Northland, and the moors glittered beneath the stars with frost and steel-grey ice. To seek out their way, Belgarath cast an enchantment, and took the shape of a great wolf. On silent feet, he slunk through the snow-floored forests, where the trees cracked and shattered in the sundering cold. Grim frost silvered the ruff and shoulders of the wolf, and ever after, the hair and beard of Belgarath were silver. Through snow and mist they crossed into Meloria, and came at last to Cathal Mishrak. Finding a secret way into the city, Belgarath led them to the foot of the iron tower. Silently they climbed the rusted stairs, which had known no step for 20 centuries. Fearfully they passed through the chamber where Torak tossed in pain-haunted slumber, his maimed face hidden by a steel mask. Stealthily they crept past the sleeping god in the smoldering darkness, and came at last to the chamber where lay the iron cask, in which rested the living orb. Cherek motioned for Belgarath to take the orb, but Belgarath refused. "I may not touch it," he said, "lest it destroy me. Once it welcomed the touch of man or god, but its will hardened when Torak used it against its mother. I will not be so used again. It will not be so used again. It reads our souls. Only one without ill intent, who is pure enough to take it and convey it in peril of his life, with no thought of power or possession, may touch it now." "What man has no ill intent in the silence of his soul?" Cherek asked. But Riva Irongrip opened the cask and took up the orb. Its fire shone through his fingers, but he was not burned. "So be it, Cherek," Belgarath said. "Your younger son is pure. It shall be his doom, and the doom of all who follow him, to bear the orb and protect it." And Belgarath sighed, knowing the burden he had placed upon Riva. "When his brothers and I—" "Then his brothers and I will sustain him," Cherek said, "for so long as this doom is upon him." Riva muffled the orb in his cloak and hid it beneath his tunic. They crept down through the chambers of the maimed god, down the rusted stairs, along the secret way to the gates of the city, and into the wasteland beyond. Soon after, Torak awoke. and went as always to the chamber of the orb. But the cask stood open, and the orb was gone. Horrible was the wrath of Kal Torak. Taking up his great sword, he went down from the iron tower, and turned and smote it once, and the tower fell. To the Angarax he cried out in a voice of thunder, "Because you are become indolent and unwatchful, and have let a thief steal that for which I paid so dear, I will break your city and drive you forth. Angarak shall wander the earth until Krag Yaska, the burning stone, is returned to me." Then he cast down the city of night in the ruins and drove the hosts of Angarak into the wilderness. Cathal Mishrak was no more. 3 leagues to the north, Belgarath heard the wailing from the city and knew that Torak had awakened. "Now he will come after us," he said, "and only the power of the orb can save us. When the hosts are upon us, Iron Grip, take the orb and hold it so they may see it." The hosts of Angarak came, with Torak himself in the forefront, but Riva held forth the orb, so that the maimed god and his hosts might behold it. The orb knew its enemy. Its hatred flamed anew, and the sky became alight with its fury. Torak cried out and turned away. The front ranks of the Angarak hosts were consumed by fire, and the rest fled in terror. Thus Belgarath and his companions escaped from Meloria, and passed again through the marches of the north, bearing the Orb of Aldor once more into the kingdoms of the west. Now the gods, knowing all that had passed, held council, and Aldor advised them. "If we raise war again upon our brother Torak, our strife will destroy the world. Thus we must absent ourselves from the world, so that our brother may not find us. No longer in flesh, but in spirit only, may we remain to guide and protect our people. For the world's sake it must be made so. In the day that we war again, the world will be unmade." The gods wept that they must depart, but Shaldan, bull god of the Arans, asked, "In our absence, shall not Torak have dominion?" "Not so," Alder replied. "So long as the orb remains with the line of Riva Irongrip, Torak shall not prevail." So it was that the gods departed, and only Torak remained. But the knowledge that the orb in the hand of Riva denied him dominion cankered in his soul. Then Belgarath spoke with Cherik and his sons. "Ere we must part, to guard the orb and to prepare against the coming of Torak. Let each turn aside as I have instructed, and make preparations." "We will, Belgarath," vowed Cherik Bareshoulders. "From this day, Aloria is no more, but the Alorns will deny dominion to Torak as long as one Alord remains." Belgarath raised his face. "Hear me, Torak One-Eye," he cried. "The living orb is secure against thee, and thou shalt not prevail against it. In the day that thou comest against us, I shall raise war against thee. I will maintain watch upon thee by day and by night, and will abide against thy coming, even to the end of days." In the wastelands of Meloria, Kal Torak heard the voice of Belgarath and smote about him in fury, for he knew that the living orb was forever beyond his reach. Then Cherik embraced his sons and turned away to see them no more. Dras went north and dwelt in the lands drained by the river Marin. He built a city at Baktor and called his lands Drasnia, and he and his descendants stood athwart the northern marches and denied them to the enemy. Algar went south with his people, and found horses on the broad plains drained by the Aldor River. The horses they tamed and learned to ride for the first time in the history of man. Mounted warriors appeared. Their country they called Algaria, and they became nomads, following their herds. Cherik returned sadly to Val Alorn, and renamed his kingdom Cherik, for now he was alone and without sons. Grimly he built tall ships of war to patrol the seas, and deny them up to the enemy. Upon the bearer of the orb, however, fell the burden of the longest journey. Taking his people, Riva went to the west coast of Sandaria. There he built ships, and he and his people crossed to the Isle of the Winds. They burned their ships and built a fortress and a walled city around it. Their city they called Riva, and the fortress the Hall of the Revan King. Then Balar, god of the Alorns, caused 2 iron stars to fall from the sky. Riva took up the stars and forged a blade from one and a hilt from the other, setting the orb upon it as a pommel stone. So large was the sword that none but Riva could wield it. In the wasteland of Meloria, Kaltorak felt in his soul the forging of the sword, and he tasted fear for the first time. The sword was set against the black rock that stood at the back of Riva's throne, with the orb at its highest point, and the sword joined to the rock so that none but Riva could remove it. The orb burned with cold fire when Riva sat upon the throne, and when he took down the sword and raised it, it became a great tongue of cold fire. The greatest wonder of all was the marking of Riva's heir. In each generation, one child in the line of Riva bore upon the palm of his right hand the mark of the orb. The child so marked was taken to the throne chamber, and his hand was placed upon the orb, so that it might know him. With each infant touch, the orb waxed in brilliance, and the bond between the living orb and the line of Riva became stronger with each joining. After Belgarath had parted from his companions, he hastened to the Vale of Aldor, but there he found that Peledra, his wife, had borne twin daughters and then had died. In sorrow, he named the elder Polgara. Her hair was dark as the raven's wing. In the fashion of sorcerers, he stretched forth his hand to lay it upon her brow, and a single lock at her forehead turned frost white at his touch. Then he was troubled, for the white lock was the mark of the sorcerers, and Polgara was the first female child to be so marked. His second daughter, fair-skinned and golden-haired, was unmarked. He called her Belderan, and he and her dark-haired sister loved each other beyond all else, and contended with each other for affection. Now when Polgara and Belderan had reached their 16th year, the spirit of Aldor came to Belgarath in a dream, saying, "My beloved disciple, I would join thy house with the house of the guardian of the orb. Choose therefore which of thy daughters thou wilt give to the Revan king to be his wife, and the mother of his line, for in that line lies the hope of the world, against which the dark power of Torak may not prevail." In the deep silence of his soul, Belgarath was tempted to choose Polgara, but knowing the burden which lay upon the Revan king, he sent Belderan instead, and wept when she was gone. Polgara wept also, long and bitterly, knowing that her sister must fade and die. In time, however, they comforted each other, and came at last to know each other. They joined their powers to keep watch over Torak, and some men say that they abide still, keeping their vigil through all the uncounted centuries. That is a great prologue, and I know I have nostalgia, but that's really well done, guys. So in a moment, I will come back and we will begin part 1, titled Sandaria. Just give me a second. Thank you for your patience. So, boy, I'm just not comfortable right now. Alright. Give me one more second. I always forget that when the wife goes to bed and closes the bedroom door. That's where the upstairs air conditioning comes from. And then we light this fire and I start reading books. And I don't know if it's psychosomatic, but I get warm every time. So, Chapter 1. The first thing the boy Garion remembered was the kitchen at Faldor's farm. For all the rest of his life, he had a special warm feeling for kitchens, and those peculiar sounds and smells that seemed somehow to combine into a bustling seriousness that had to do with love and food and comfort, and security, and above all, home. No matter how high Garion rose in life, he never forgot that all his memories began in that kitchen. Yeah, that's a good point, man. That will be nice when the weather starts to turn a little bit cooler. The kitchen at Faldor's farm was a large, low-beamed room, filled with ovens and kettles and great spits that turned slowly in cabin-like arched fireplaces. There were long, heavy work tables where bread was kneaded into loaves and chickens were cut up and carrots and celery were diced with quick, crisp rocking movements of long, curved knives. When Garion was very small, he played under those tables and soon learned to keep his fingers and toes out from under the feet of the kitchen helpers who worked around them. And sometimes in the late afternoon when he grew tired, he would lie in a corner and stare into one of the flickering fires that gleamed and reflected back from the 100 polished pots and knives and long-handled spoons that hung from the pegs along the whitewashed walls. And, all bemused, he would drift off into sleep in perfect peace and harmony with all the world around him. The center of the kitchen and everything that happened there was Aunt Poll. She seemed somehow to be able to be everywhere at once. The finishing touch that plumped a goose in the roasting pan or deftly shaped a rising loaf or garnished a smoking ham fresh from the oven was always hers. Though there were several others who worked in the kitchen, no loaf, stew, soup, roast, or vegetable ever went out of it that had not been touched at least once by Aunt Poll. She knew by smell and taste, or some higher instinct, what each dish required, and she seasoned them all by pinch or trace or a negligent-seeming shake from an earthenware spice-pots. It was as if there was a kind of magic about her, a knowledge and power beyond that of ordinary people, and yet even at her busiest, she always knew precisely where Garion was. In the very midst of crimping a pie crust, or decorating a special cake, or stitching up freshly stuffed chicken, she could, without looking, reach out a leg and hook him back from under the feet of others, with heel or ankle. As he grew a bit older, it even became a game. Garion would watch until she seemed far too busy to notice him, and then laughing he would run on his sturdy little legs towards the door, but she would always catch him, and he would laugh and throw his arms around her neck and kiss her, and then go back to watching for his next chance to run away again. He was quite convinced in those early years that his Aunt Poll was quite the most important and beautiful woman in the world. For one thing, she was taller than the other woman on Faldor's farm, very nearly as tall as a man, and her face was always very serious, even stern, except with him, of course. Her hair was long and very dark, almost black, all but one lock just above her left brow, which was white as new snow. At night, when she tucked him into the little bed close beside her own in their private room above the kitchen, he would reach out and touch that white lock, and she would smile at him and touch his face with a soft hand. Then he would sleep, content in the knowledge that she was there, watching over him. Faldor's farm lay very nearly in the center of Sundaria, a misty kingdom bordered on the west by the Sea of the Winds and on the east by the Gulf of Charak. Like all farmhouses in that particular time and place, Faldor's farmstead was not one building or two, but rather was a solidly constructed complex of sheds and barns, and hen roosts and dovecotes, all facing inward upon the central yard with a stout gate at the front. Along the second-story gallery were rooms, some spacious, some quite tiny, in which lived the farm hands, who tilled and planted and weeded the extensive fields beyond the walls. Faldor himself lived in quarters in the square tower above the central dining hall, where his workers assembled 3 times a day, sometimes 4 during harvest time, to feast on the bounty of Aunt Poll's kitchen. All in all, it was quite a happy and harmonious place. Farmer Faldor was a good master. He was a tall, serious man with a long nose and an even longer jaw. Though he seldom laughed or even smiled, he was kindly to those who worked for him, and seemed more intent on maintaining them all in health and well-being than extracting the last possible ounce of sweat from them. In many ways, he was more like a father than a master to the 60-odd people who lived on his freeholding. He ate with them, which was unusual since many farmers in the district sought to hold themselves aloof from their workers, and his presence at the head of the central table in the dining hall exerted a restraining influence on some of the younger ones who tended sometimes to be boisterous. Farmer Faldor was a devout man, and he invariably invoked with simple eloquence the blessing of the gods before each meal. The people of his farm, knowing this, filed with some decorum into the dining hall before each meal and sat in the semblance at least of piety, before attacking the heaping platters and bowls of food that Aunt Poll and her helpers had placed before them. Because of Faldor's good heart and the magic of Aunt Poll's deft fingers, the farm was known throughout the district as the finest place to live and work for 20 leagues in any direction. Whole evenings were spent in the tavern in the nearby village of Upper Gralt, and minute descriptions of the near miraculous meals served regularly in Faldor's dining hall. Less fortunate men who worked at other farms were frequently seen, after several pots of ale, to weep openly at descriptions of one of Aunt Poll's roasted geese, and the fame of Faldor's farm spread wide throughout the district. The most important man on the farm, aside from Faldor, was Dernick the smith. As Garyon grew older and was allowed to move out from under Aunt Poll's watchful eye, he found his way inevitably to the smithy. The glowing iron that came from Dernick's forge had an almost hypnotic attraction for him. Dernick was an ordinary-looking man, with plain brown hair and a plain face, ruddy from the heat of the forge. He was neither tall nor short, nor was he thin or stout. He was sober and quiet, and like most men who follow his trade, he was enormously strong. He wore a rough leather jerkin and an apron of the same material. Both were spotted with burns from the sparks which flew from his forge. He also wore tight-fitting hose and soft leather boots, as was custom in that part of Sandaria. At first, Dernick's only words to Garyon were warnings to keep his fingers away from the forge and the glowing metal which came from it. In time, however, he and the boy became friends, and he spoke more frequently. "Always finish what you set your hand to," he would advise. "It's bad for iron if you set it aside and then take it back to the fire more than is needful." "Why is that?" Garyon would ask. Dernick would shrug. "It just is." "Always do the very best job you can," he said, on another occasion, as he put a few finishing touches with a file on the metal parts of a wagon tongue he was repairing. "But that piece goes underneath," Garyon said. "No one will ever see it." "But I know it's there," Dernick said, still smothering the metal. "If it isn't done as well as I can do it, I'll be ashamed every time I see this wagon go by, and I'll see the wagon every day." And so it went, without even intending to. Dernick instructed the small boy in those solid Sundarian virtues of work, thrift, sobriety, good manners, and practicality which formed the backbone of the society. At first, Aunt Poll worried about Garyon's attractions to the smithy with its obvious dangers, but after watching from her kitchen door for a while, she realized that Dernick was almost as watchful as Garyon's safety as she was herself. She became less concerned. "If the boy becomes pestersome, Goodman Dernick, send him away," she told the smith one occasion, when she had brought a large copper kettle to the smithy to be patched. "Or tell me, and I'll keep him closer to the kitchen." "He's no bother, Mr. Spall," Dernick said, smiling. "He's a sensible boy, and knows enough to keep out of the way." "You're too good-natured, friend Dernick," Aunt Poll said. "The boy is full of questions. Answer one, and a dozen more pour out." "That's the way of boys," Dernick said, carefully pouring bubbling metal into the small clay ring he had placed around the tiny hole in the bottom of the kettle. "I was questioning myself when I was a boy. My father and old Barl the smith who taught me were patient enough to answer what they could. I'd repay them poorly if I didn't have the same patience with Garyon." Garyon, who was sitting nearby, had held his breath during this conversation. He knew that one wrong word on either side would have instantly banished him from the smithy. As Aunt Poll walked back across the hard-packed dirt of the yard toward her kitchen with the new-mended kettle, he noticed the way that Dernick watched her, and an idea began to form in his mind. It was a simple idea, and the beauty of it was that it provided something for everyone. "Aunt Poll," he said that night, wincing as she washed one of his ears with a rough cloth. "Yes," she said, turning her attention to his neck. "Why don't you marry Dernick?" She stopped washing. "What?" she asked. I think it'd be an awfully good idea. Oh, do you? Her voice had a slight edge to it, and Garion knew he was on dangerous ground. He likes you, he said defensively. And I suppose you've already discussed this with him. No, he said. I thought I'd talk to you about it first. At least that was a good idea. I can tell him about it tomorrow morning if you'd like. His head was turned around quite firmly by one ear, and Paul Garion found his ears far too convenient. Don't you so much as breathe one word of this nonsense to Dernick or anyone else, she said, her dark eyes burning into his with a fire he had never seen there before. It was only a thought, he said quickly. A very bad one. From now on, leave thinking to grown-ups. She was still holding his ear. Anything you say, he agreed hastily. Later that night, however, when they lay in their beds in the quiet darkness, he approached the problem obliquely. Aunt Paul? Yes? Since you don't want to marry Dernick, whom do you want to marry? Garion, she said. Yes. Close your mouth and go to sleep. I think I've got a right to know, he said in an injured tone. Garion? All right, I'm going to sleep. But I don't think you're being very fair about all this. She drew in a deep breath. Very well, she said. I'm not thinking of getting married. I've never thought of getting married, and I seriously doubt that I'll ever think of getting married. I have far too many important things to attend to for any of that. Don't worry, Aunt Paul, he said, wanting to put her mind at ease. When I grow up, I'll marry you. She laughed then, a deep, rich laugh, and reached out to touch his face in the darkness. Oh no, my Garion, she said. There's another wife in store for you. Who? He demanded. You'll find out, she said mysteriously. Now go to sleep. Aunt Paul. Yes? Where's my mother? It was a question he had been meaning to ask for quite some time. I'm going to interrupt myself and apologize to you folks if I get emotional at parts of this. I've read this many times. It's one of my favorite novels. And there are moments that are really poignant in my mind. So, I'll try to keep it together. Where's my mother? It was a question he'd been meaning to ask for some time. There was a long pause, and then Aunt Paul sighed. She died, she said quietly. Garion felt a sudden, wrenching surge of grief. Nope, not going to be able to keep it together. Garion felt a sudden, wrenching surge of grief, an unbearable anguish. He began to cry. And then she was beside his bed. She knelt on the floor and put her arms around him. Finally, a long time later, after she had carried him to her own bed and held him close until his grief had run its course, Garion asked brokenly, What was she like, my mother? She was fair-haired, Aunt Paul said, and very young and very beautiful. Her voice was gentle, and she was very happy. Did she love me? More than you could imagine. And then he cried again, but his crying was quieter now, more regretful than anguished. Aunt Paul held him closely till he cried himself to sleep. There were other tongue become smaller, mouth become larger. There we go. There were other children on Faldor's farm. See, it works. As was only natural in a community of 60 or so. The older ones on the farm all worked, but there were 3 other children of about Garion's age on the freeholding. These 3 became his playmates and his friends. The oldest boy was named Runderig. He was a year or 2 older than Garion and quite a bit taller. Ordinarily, since he was the eldest of the children, Runderig would have been their leader. But because he was an Arend, his sense was a bit limited, and he cheerfully deferred to the younger ones. The kingdom of Sindaria, unlike other kingdoms, was inhabited by a broad variety of racial stocks. Cherriks, Algars, Drasnians, Arends, and even a substantial number of Talnedrins had merged to form the elemental Sendar. Arends, of course, were very brave, but were also notoriously thick-witted. Garion's second playmate was Darun, a small, quick boy whose background was so mixed that he can only be described as a Sendar. The most notable thing about Darun was the fact that he was always running. He never walked if he could run. Like his feet, his mind seemed to tumble over itself, and his tongue as well. He talked continuously, and very fast, and he was always excited. The undisputed leader of their little foursome was the girl Zubret, a golden-haired charmer who invented their games, made up stories to tell them, and set them to stealing apples and plums from Fowler's orchard for her. She ruled them as a little queen, playing one against the other and inciting them into fights. She was quite heartless. Each of the three boys at times hated her, even while remaining helpless thralls to her tiniest whim. Excuse me 1 second, guys. I'll be right back. Alright. In the winter, they slid on wide boards down the snowy hillside behind the farmhouse and returned home, wet and snow-covered, with chapped hands and glowing cheeks as evening's purple shadows crept across the snow. Or, after Dernick the Smith had proclaimed the ice safe, they would slide endlessly across the frozen pond that lay glittering frostily in a little dale just to the east of the farm buildings, along the road to Upper Gwalt. And if the weather was too cold, or on toward spring when rains and warm winds had made the snow slushy and the pond unsafe, they would gather in the hay barn and leap by the hour from the loft into the soft hay beneath, filling their hair with chaff and their noses with dust that smelled of summer. In the spring they caught pollywogs along the marshy edges of the pond and climbed trees to stare in wonder at the tiny blue eggs the birds had laid in twiggy nests in the high branches. It was Darun, naturally, who fell from a tree and broke his arm one fine spring morning when Zubret urged him into the highest branches of a tree near the edge of the pond. Since Runderig stood helplessly gaping at his injured friend, and Zubret had run away almost before he hit the ground, it fell to Garion to make certain necessary decisions. Gravely, he considered the situation for a few moments, his young face seriously intent beneath his shock of sandy hair. The arm was obviously broken, and Darun, pale and frightened, bit his lip to keep from crying. A movement caught Garion's eye, and he glanced up quickly. A man in a dark cloak sat astride a large black horse not far away, watching intently. When their eyes met, Garion felt a momentary chill, and knew that he had seen the man before. That indeed that dark figure had hovered on the edge of his vision for as long as he could remember, never speaking, but always watching. There was in that silent scrutiny a kind of cold animosity, curiously mingled with something that was almost but not quite fear. Then Darun whimpered, and Garion turned back. Carefully he bound the injured arm across the front of Darun's body with his rope belt, and then he and Runderig helped the injured boy to his feet. At least he could have helped us, Garion said, resentfully. Who? Runderig asked, looking around. Garion turned to point at the dark-cloaked man, but the rider was gone. I didn't see anyone. It hurts, Darun said. Don't worry, Garion said. Aunt Pa will fix it. And so she did. When the three appeared at the door of her kitchen, she took in the situation with a single glance. Bring him over here, she told them, her voice not even excited. She set the pale and violently trembling boy on a stool near one of the ovens, and mixed a tea of several herbs taken from earthenware jars on a high shelf in the back of one of her pantries. Drink this, she instructed Darun, handing him a steaming mug. Would make my arm well? Darun asked, suspiciously eyeing the evil-smelling brew. Just drink it, she ordered, laying out some splints and linen strips. Ugh, it tastes awful, Darun said, making a face. It's supposed to, she told him. Drink it all. I don't think I want any more, he said. Very well, she said. She pushed back the splints and took down a long, very sharp knife from a hook on the wall. What are you going to do with that? He demanded shakily. Since you don't want to take the medicine, she said blandly, I guess it'll have to come off. Off? Darun squeaked, his eyes bulging. Probably about right there, she said, thoughtfully touching his arm at the elbow with the point of the knife. Tears coming to his eyes, Darun gulped down the rest of the liquid, and a few minutes later, he was nodding, almost drowsing, on his stool. He screamed once, though, when Aunt Poll set the broken bone. But after the arm had been wrapped and splintered, he drowsed again. Aunt Poll spoke briefly with the boy's frightened mother, and then had Dernick carry him up to bed. Okay. Listen. I don't know what's going on. But my body's getting pissed off at me for some reason. God, being old sucks. You wouldn't really have cut off his arm, Garion said. Aunt Poll looked at him, her expression not changing. Oh, man. Excuse me, guys, I'm sorry. Oh, she said, and he was no longer sure. I think I'd like to have a word with Miss Soubrette now, she said then. She ran away when Darun fell out of the tree, Garion said. Find her. She's hiding, Garion protested. She always hides when something goes wrong. I wouldn't know where to look for her. Garion, Aunt Poll said, I didn't ask if you knew where to look. I told you to find her and bring her to me. What if she won't come? Garion hedged. Garion! There was a note of awful finality in Aunt Poll's tone, and Garion fled. I didn't have anything to do with it, Soubrette lied as soon as Garion led her to Aunt Poll in the kitchen. Oh. You, Aunt Poll said, pointing at a stool. Sit. Soubrette sank onto the stool, her mouth open and her eyes wide. You, Aunt Poll said to Garion, pointing at the kitchen door. Out. Garion left hurriedly. 10 minutes later, a sobbing little girl stumbled out of the kitchen. Aunt Poll stood in the doorway, looking after her with eyes as hard as ice. Did you thrash her? Garion asked hopefully. Aunt Poll withered him with a glance. Of course not, she said. You don't thrash girls. I would have, Garion said, disappointed. What did you do to her? Don't you have anything to do? Aunt Poll asked. No, Garion said. Not really. That, of course, was a mistake. Good, Aunt Poll said, finding one of his ears. It's time you started to earn your way. You'll find some dirty pots in the scullery. I'd like to have them scrubbed. I don't know why you're angry with me, Garion objected, squirming. It wasn't my fault that Darun went up that tree. The scullery, Garion. Now. The rest of that spring and the early part of the summer were quiet. Darun, of course, could not play until his arm had mended, and Soubrette had been so shaken by whatever it was that Aunt Poll had said to her that she avoided the two other boys. Garion was left with only Runderig to play with, and Runderig was not bright enough to be much fun, because there was really nothing else to do. The boys often went to the fields to watch the hands work and listen to their talk. Need a drink of water and my eyes itchy and I don't know what's going on. Having a bit of an allergy attack or something. Urgh. Really? Definitely having an allergy attack. What the hell? As it happened, during that particular summer, the men on Fowler's farm were talking about the Battle of Vaux Mimbray, the most cataclysmic event in the history of the West. Garion and Runderig listened enthralled as the men unfolded the story of how the borders of Cal Torak had quite suddenly struck into the west. Not the borders. How the hordes of Cal Torak had quite suddenly struck into the west some 500 years before. It had all begun in 4865, as men reckoned time in that part of the world, when vast multitudes of Murgos and Nadraks and Thuls had struck down across the mountains of the eastern escarpment into Drasnia, and behind them in endless waves had come the uncountable numbers of Malorians. After Drasnia had been brutally crushed, the Angaraks had turned southward onto the vast grasslands of Algaria and had laid siege to that enormous fortress called the Algarian Stronghold. The siege had lasted for 8 years until finally, in disgust, Cal Torak had abandoned it. It was not until he turned his army westward into Ulgoland that the other kingdoms became aware that the Angarak invasion was directed not only against the Alorns, but against all of the West. In the summer of 4875, Kaltorak had come down upon the Orendish plain before the city of Omimbre, and it was there that the combined armies of the West awaited him. The Sendars who participated in the battle were a part of the force under the leadership of Brand, the Revan warder. That force, consisting of Revans, Sendars, and Asturian Arends, assaulted the Angarak rear after the left had been engaged by the Algars, Drasnians, and Olgos, the right by Talnedrans and Sheriks, and the front by the legendary charge of the Mimbrate and Arends. For hours, the battle had raged until, in the center of the field, Brand had met single combat with Kal Torak himself. Upon that duel, it hinged the outcome of the battle. Although 20 generations had passed since the Titanic encounter, it was still as fresh in the memory of the Sandarian farmers who worked on Faldor's farm as if it had happened only yesterday. Each blow was described and each feint and parry. At the final moment, when it seemed that he must inevitably be overthrown, Brand had removed the covering from his shield, and Kaltorak, taken aback by some momentary confusion, had lowered his guard and had been instantly struck down. Okay, Dr. Madnar, see you soon. I'll read slow. For Runderig, the description of the battle was enough to set his horrendous blood seething. Garion, however, found that certain questions had been left unanswered by the stories. Why was Brand's shield covered? He asked Kralto, one of the other hands. One of the older hands. Boy, I can't read tonight. The allergy text not helping. Sorry, guys. Let's try that again. Why was Brand's shield covered? He asked Kralto, one of the older hands. Kralto shrugged. It just was, he said. Everyone I've ever talked to about it agrees on that. Was it a magic shield? Garion persisted. It may have been, Kralto said, but I've never heard anyone say so. All I know is that when Brand uncovered his shield, Kaltorak dropped his own shield, and Brand stabbed the sword into Kaltorak's head. Through the eye, so I'm told. Garion shook his head stubbornly. I don't understand, he said. How would something like that have made Kaltorak afraid? I can't say, Kralto told him. I've never heard anyone explain it. Despite his dissatisfaction with the story, Garion quite quickly agreed to Runderig's rather simple plan to reenact the duel. After a day or so of posturing and banging at each other with sticks to simulate swords, Garion decided they needed some equipment to make the game more enjoyable. 2 kettles and 2 large pot lids mysteriously disappeared from Aunt Paul's kitchen, and Garion and Runderig, now with helmets and shields, repaired to a quiet place to do war upon each other. It was all going quite splendidly until Runderig, who was older, taller, and stronger, struck Garion a resounding whack on his head with a wooden sword. The rim of the kettle cut into Garion's eyebrow, and the blood began to flow. There was a sudden ringing in Garion's ears, and a kind of boiling exultation surged up in his veins as he rose to his feet from the ground. He never knew afterward quite what had happened. He had only sketchy memories of shouting defiance at Kaltorak in words which sprang to his lips and which even he did not understand. Runderig's familiar and somewhat foolish face no longer looked the face before him, but rather was replaced by something hideously maimed and ugly. In a fury, Garion struck at that face again and again, with fire seething in his brain. And then it was over. Poor Runderig lay at his feet, beaten senseless by the enraged attack. Garion was horrified at what he had done, but at the same time, there was the fiery taste of victory in his mouth. Later, in the kitchen, where all injuries on the farm were routinely taken, Aunt Paul tended their wounds with only minimal comments about them. Runderig seemed not to be seriously hurt, though his face had begun to swell and turn purple in several places, and he had difficulty focusing his eyes at first. A few cold cloths on his head and one of Aunt Paul's potions quickly restored him. The cut on Garion's brow, however, required a bit more attention. She had Dernick hold the boy down, and then she took needle and thread, and sewed up the cut as calmly as she would have repaired a rip in a sleeve, all the while ignoring the howls from her patient. All in all, she seemed much more concerned about the dented kettles and battered pot lids than about the war wounds of the 2 boys. When it was over, Garion had a headache and was taken up to bed. At least I beat Kaltorak, he told Aunt Paul somewhat drowsily. She looked at him sharply. Where did you hear that name, Torak? She demanded. It's Kaltorak, Aunt Paul, Garion explained patiently. Answer me! The farmers were telling stories, old Kralto and the others, about Brand and Volmimbre and Kaltorak and all the rest. That's what Runderig and I were playing. I was Brand and he was Kaltorak. I didn't get to uncover my shield, though. Runderig hit me on the head before we got that far. I want you to listen to me, Garion, Aunt Paul said. And I want you to listen carefully. You are never to speak the name of Torak again. It's Kaltorak, Aunt Paul, Garion explained again. Not just Torak. Then she hit him, which she had never done before. The slap across his mouth surprised him more than it hurt, for she did not hit very hard. You will never speak the name of Torak again. Never, she said. This is important, Garion. Your safety depends on it. I want your promise. You don't have to get so angry about it, he said, an injured tone. Promise. All right, I promise. It was only a game. A very foolish one, Aunt Paul said. You might have killed Runderig. What about me? Garion protested. You were never in any danger, she told him. Now go to sleep. And as he dozed fitfully, his head light from his injury, and the strange bitter drink his aunt had given him, he seemed to hear her deep, rich voice saying, Garion, my Garion, you're too young yet. And later, rising from deep sleep as a fish rises toward the silvery surface of the water, he seemed to hear her call, Father, I need you. Then he plunged again into troubled sleep, haunted by a dark figure of a man on a black horse, who watched his every movement with cold animosity, and something that hovered very near to the edge of fear. And behind that dark figure he had always known there to be there, but had never overly acknowledged, even to Aunt Paul. The maimed and ugly face he had briefly seen or imagined in the fight with Runderig loomed darkly, like the hideous fruit of an unspeakable evil tree. Chapter 2. Not long after, in the endless noon of Garion's boyhood, the storyteller appeared once again at the gate of Faldor's farm. The storyteller, who seemed not to have a proper name as other men do, was a thoroughly disreputable old man. The knees of his hose were patched and his mismatched shoes were out at the toes. His long-sleeved woolen tunic was belted about the waist with a piece of rope, and his hood, a curious garment not normally worn in that part of Sundaria, and one which Garion thought quite fine with its loosely fitting yoke covering his shoulders, back and chest, was spotted and soiled with spilled food and drink. Only his full cloak seemed relatively new. The old storyteller's white hair was cropped quite close, as was his beard. His face was strong with a kind of angularity to it, and his features provided no clue to his background. He did not resemble Erend or Cherik, Algar nor Draznian, Revan nor Talnedrin, but seemed rather to derive from some racial stock long since forgotten. His eyes were a deep and merry blue, forever young and forever full of mischief. The storyteller appeared from time to time at Faldor's farm, and was always welcome. He was, in truth, a rootless vagabond who made his way in the world by telling stories. His stories were not always new, but there was in his telling of them a special kind of magic. His voice could roll like thunder, or hush down into a zephyr-like whisper. He could imitate the voices of a dozen men at once, whistle so like a bird that the birds themselves would come to him to hear what he had to say, and when he imitated the howl of a wolf, the sound could raise the hairs on the back of the listeners' necks and strike a chill into their hearts like the depths of a Draznian winter. He could make the sound of rain and of wind, and even most miraculously the sound of snow falling. His stories were filled with sounds that made them come alive, and through the sounds and the words with them, with which he wrote. I'm gonna try again. Stumbling tonight, guys. Sorry. His stories were filled with sounds that made them come alive, and through the sounds and the words with which he wove the tales, sight and smell, and the very feel of strange times and places seemed also to come to life for his spellbound listeners. All of his wonder he gave freely in exchange for a few meals, a few tankards of ale, and a warm spot in the hay barn in which to sleep. He roamed about the world seemingly as free of possessions as the birds. Between the storyteller and Aunt Paul there seemed to be a sort of hidden recognition. She had always viewed his coming with a kind of wry acceptance, knowing it seemed that the ultimate treasures of her kitchen were not safe as long as he lurked in the vicinity. Loaves and cakes had a way of disappearing when he was around, and his quick knife, always ready, could neatly divest the most carefully prepared goose of a pair of drumsticks and a generous slab of breast meat with 3 swift slices when her back was turned. She called him Old Wolf, and his appearance at the gate of Faldor's farm marked the resumption of a contest which had obviously been going on for years. He flattered her outrageously even as he stole from her. Offered cookies or dark brown bread he would politely refuse, and then steal half a plateful before the platter had moved out of his reach. Her beer pantry and wine cellar might as well have been delivered into his hands immediately upon his appearance at the gate. He seemed to delight in pilferage, and if she watched him with steely eyes, he found quite easily a dozen confederates willing to sack her kitchen in exchange for a single story. Lamentably, among his most apt pupils was the boy Garyon. Often driven to distraction by the necessity of watching at once an old thief and a fledgling one, Aunt Poll would arm herself with a broom and drive them both from her kitchen, with hard words and resounding blows, and the old storyteller, laughing, would flee with the boy to some secluded place where they would feast on the fruits of their pilferage, and the old man, tasting frequently from a flagon of stolen wine or beer, would regale his student with stories out of the dim past. The best stories, of course, were saved for the dining hall, when, after the evening meal was over, and the plates had been pushed back, the old man would rise from his place and carry his listeners off into a world of magical enchantment. Just like I do with you guys, except I get to read instead of tell stories. No, not really. I'm sure he's much better at it than I am. Tell us of the beginnings, my old friend, Faldor, always pious, said one evening, and of the gods. Of the beginnings and of the gods, the old man mused. A worthy subject, Faldor, but a dry and dusty one. I've noticed that you find all subjects dry and dusty, Old Wolf, Aunt Poll said, going to the barrel and drawing off a tankard of foamy beer for him. He accepted the tankard with a stately bow. It's one of the hazards of my profession, Mistress Poll, he explained. He drank deeply and then set the tankard aside. He lowered his head and thought for a moment, and then looked directly, or so it seemed, at Garyon. And then he did a strange thing which he had never done before when telling stories in Faldor's dining hall. He drew his cloak about him and rose to his full height. Behold, he said, his voice rich and sonorous, at the beginning of days made the gods the world and the seas and the dry land also. And cast they the stars across the night sky, and did set the sun and his wife the moon in the heavens to give light unto the world. And the gods caused the earth to bring forth its beasts, and the waters to bud with fish, and the skies to flower with birds. And they made men also, and divided men into peoples. Now the gods were 7 in number, and were all equal, and their names were Belar, and Chaldan, and Nedra, and Issa, and Mara, and Alder, and Torak. Garyon knew the story, of course. Everyone in that part of Sandaria was familiar with it, since the story was of Alorn origin, and the lands on 3 sides of Sandaria were Alorn kingdoms. Though the tale was familiar, however, he had never before heard it told in such a way. His mind soared as his imagination. The gods themselves strode in a world in those dim, misty days when the world was first made, and a chill came over him at each mention of the forbidden name of Torak. He listened intently as the story I said, yep, it's that kind of night with reading, apparently. Perhaps I need a good night's sleep. He listened intently as the storyteller described how each god selected a people. For Belar the Alorns, for Issa the Nissians, for Chaldan the Arens, for Nedra the Talnedrans, for Mara the Marags, which are no more, and for Torak the Angarax. No, I'm pretty good, Moose. You want me to stop? Do you want me to go away? Chapter 2 is actually not very long. And for Torak, the Angarax. And he heard how the god Aldor dwelt apart and considered the stars in his solitude, and how some very few men he accepted as pupils and disciples. Thanks, man. No, I'm good. I slept till 7:30 after coming home from work today. I went to bed at like 2, so I'm pretty well rested, but it got warm in here. Garion glanced at the others who were listening. Their faces were rapt with attention. Durnik's eyes were wide, and old Krautos' hands were clasped on the table in front of him. Faldor's face was pale, and tears stood in his eyes. Aunt Paul stood at the rear of the room. But it was not cold. She, too, had drawn her mantle about her and stood very straight, her eyes intent. And it came to pass, the storyteller continued, that the god Aldor caused to be made a jewel in the shape of a globe, and behold, in the jewel was captured the light of certain stars that did glitter in the northern sky. And great was the enchantment upon the jewel, which the men called the Orb of Aldor. For with the orb could Aldor see that which had been, that which was, and that which was yet to be. Garion realized he was holding his breath, for he was now completely caught up in the story. He listened in wonder as Torak stole the orb and the other gods made war on him. Torak used the orb to sunder the earth and let in the sea to drown the land, until the orb struck back against misuse by melting the left side of his face and destroying his left hand and eye. The old man paused and drained his tankard. Aunt Paul, with her mantle still close about her, brought him another, her movements somehow stately, and her eyes burning. "I've never heard the story told so," said Durnik, and softly. "It's the Book of Elorn. It's only told in the presence of kings," Krautos said just as softly. "I knew a man once who had heard it at the king's court at Sendar. He remembered some of it. I've never heard it all before, though." The story continued, recounting how Belgarath the sorcerer led Sharik and his 3 sons to regain the orb 2,000 years later, and how the western lands were settled and guarded against the hosts of Torak. The gods removed from the world, leaving Riva to safeguard the orb in his fortress on the Isle of the Winds. There he forged a great sword and set the orb in its hilt. While the orb remained there and the line of Riva sat on the throne, Torak could not prevail. Then Belgarath sent his favorite daughter to Riva to be a mother to kings, while his other daughter remained with him and learned his art, for the mark of the sorceress was upon her. The old storyteller's voice was now very soft, as his ancient tale grew to its close. "And between them," he said, "did Belgarath and his daughter, the sorceress Polgara, set enchantments to keep watch against the coming of Torak. And some men say they shall abide against his coming, even though it be until the very end of days. For it is prophesied that one day shall maimed Torak come again to the kingdoms of the west to reclaim the orb which he so dearly purchased. Battle shall be joined between Torak and the fruit of the line of Riva, and in that battle shall be decided the fate of the world." And then the old man fell silent and let his mantle drop from his shoulders, signifying that his story was at an end. There was a long silence in the hall, broken only by a few faint cracks from the dying fire, and the endless song of frogs and crickets in the summer night outside. Finally, Faldor cleared his throat and rose, his bench scraping loudly on the wooden floor. "You have done us much honor, my old friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is an event we'll remember all our lives. You have told us a kingly story, not usually wasted on ordinary people." The old man grinned then, his blue eyes twinkling. "I haven't consorted with many kings of late, Faldor," he laughed. "They all seem to be too busy to listen to old tales, and a story must be told from time to time if it's not to be lost. Besides, who knows these days where a king might be hiding?" They all laughed at that and began to push back their chairs, for it was growing late, and time for those who must be up with the first light of the sun to seek their beds. "Will you carry a lantern for me to the place where I sleep, boy?" the storyteller asked Garion. "Gladly," Garion said, jumping up and running into the kitchen. he fetched down a square glass lantern, lighted a candle inside it from one of the bank kitchen fires, and went back into the dining hall. Baldur was speaking with the storyteller. As he turned away, Garion saw a strange look pass between the old man and Aunt Poll, who stood there at the back of the hall. "Are we ready then, boy?" the old man asked as Garion came up to him. "Whenever you are," Garion replied, with the two of them turned and left. "Why is the story unfinished?" Garion asked, bursting with curiosity. "Why'd you stop before we found out what happened when Torak met the Reven King?" "That's another story," the old man explained. "Will you tell it to me sometime?" Garion pressed. The old man laughed. "Torak and the Reven King have not as yet met," he said, "so I can't very well tell it, can I? At least not till after their meeting." "It's only a story," Garion objected. "Isn't it?" "Is it?" The old man removed a flagon of wine from under his tunic and took a long drink. "Who is to say? But it's only a story, and what is truth disguised as a story?" "It's only a story," Garion said stubbornly, suddenly feeling very hard-hearted and practical, like any good Centaur. "It can't really be true. Why, Belgarath the sorcerer would be I don't know how old, and people don't live that long." 7,000 years, the old man said. "What?" "Belgarath the sorcerer is 7,000 years old. Perhaps a bit older." "That's impossible," Garion said. "Is it? How old are you?" 9. Next Aristide. "And in 9 years you've learned everything that's both possible and impossible. You're a remarkable boy, Garion." Garion flushed. "Well," he said, somehow not quite so sure of himself, "the oldest man I ever heard of is old Weldrick over on Mildren's farm. Dernick says he's over 90, and he's the oldest man in the district." "And it's a very big district, of course," the old man said solemnly. "How old are you?" Garion asked, not wanting to give up. "Old enough, boy," the old man insisted. "It's still only a story," Garion insisted. "Many good and solid men would say so," the old man said to him, looking up at the stars. "Good men who live out their lives believing only in that in which they can see and touch. But there's a world beyond what we can see and touch, and that world lives by its own laws. What may be impossible in this very ordinary world is very possible there, and sometimes the boundaries between the two worlds disappear. And then, who can say what is possible and impossible?" I think I'd rather live in the ordinary world," Garion said. "The other one sounds too complicated." "We don't always have that choice, Garion," the storyteller told him. "Don't be too surprised if that other world someday chooses you to do something that must be done. Some great and noble thing." "Me?" Garion said incredulously. "Stranger things have happened. Go to bed, boy. I think we'll look at the stars for a while. The stars and I are very old friends." "The stars?" Garion asked, looking up involuntarily. "You're a very strange old man, if you don't mind my saying so." "Indeed," the storyteller agreed. "Quite the strangest you'll likely meet." "I like you all the same," Garion said quickly, not wanting to give offense. "That's a comfort, boy," the old man said. "Now go to bed. Your Aunt Poll will be worried about you." Later, as he slept, Garion's dreams were troubled. The dark figure of maimed Torak loomed in the shadows, and monstrous things pursued him. Mostly yawns. And monstrous things pursued him across twisted landscapes where the possible and the impossible merged and joined as that other world reached out to claim him. That's probably a good stopping point. Well, maybe we'll go to 4. See how long this chapter is. Yeah, let's just go out there. It's a little longer than 10 minutes, so probably more like 20 or 25. So guys, that's the first 2 chapters of Point of the Prophecy plus the prologue. Hope you enjoyed it. What did you think? For those of you who aren't familiar with it, and for those of you who are, I hope it brought back good memories. Everyone's asleep. Like it so far, Moose? That's good. I'm glad. Good stuff, Silent? Excellent. I'm glad to hear, guys. I really like it. It's one of my favorites, and I think it's a good story to read out loud, which is why I chose it. I think some of the young adult type stuff probably serves this this format really well. So. And continue from where I left off, or you could tune in tomorrow night at 1 a.m. Tomorrow, Sunday. Yeah, tomorrow night we should be on time with it, so, because I have to get up Monday. But, it was a fun stream today, guys. We finished BioShock Infinite. I have to look into the DLC for that in BioShock 2 now, and see when I'm going to do that. I'm thinking I might try to do it next weekend, so I can kind of put those to rest, but I'm most likely not streaming next Saturday, because, I think I have plans, but that'll give us something to do Sunday, maybe. Your oldest might enjoy this. Oh, that's cool. It's a really nice, Oh, sorry, Dr. Madner. Well, you can always catch the VOD. I always try to restart the, Hey, the Hummer. Thank you very much for the follow. I appreciate that. If you're enjoying the stream. I always try to... I've started restarting the streams just so that the reading portion is separate and a nice short VOD. And so you can just isolate the reading portion of the stream if you wish. They should be in, you know, those 1 hour chunks more or less. But, yeah, we will continue again tomorrow night with this. I don't know what I'm going to play tomorrow, guys. I haven't decided yet. I have some game cleanup to do, so I'll probably look at more of that. Maybe some Duke Nukem. We might jump around a little bit. Maybe a chill stream. I'm not sure. We'll see how I feel tomorrow about it. But, what do we got coming up? So we're doing that tomorrow. We're going to continue reading Pawn of the Prophecy, which is relatively short. We read tonight 32 pages, which has been right around our average, I think. Seems to take us about an hour to do that. Yep, 32 pages. Which means we will finish this book in about a week because it's 250 pages. So I'm going to probably shoot for that. Probably to finish it by next weekend, and we'll go from there. If you guys really like it, we'll probably go right into the second one. Just because I like, if we're going to read a series, I'd like to read the series straight through. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings being separate because there's a huge gap between them, so I didn't feel compelled to read Lord of the Rings right away. Plus, it's a huge chunk of reading. Lord of the Rings is long compared to this. And then Monday we're going to play more Longest Journey. Tuesday we will be starting The Witcher. That was the next action RPG voted on. Wednesday we will continue Wizardry and try not to die, and see if we can finish mapping level 6 and get on to level 7. We have to finish leveling our new fighter shooter Q up, and we'll probably be mourning some more dead before the night's out, but I hope not. Thursday we will be playing whatever action game wins this poll, so I'm going to leave that poll up for a couple more days. Yeah, it seems to be the way to do it, Moose. I'm not going to jump around like I do with games, because reading is reading, and I like getting through the story. Also, each book does not wrap up. You really need to read the next one. You want to read the next one as soon as you're done, generally. Yeah, so that's pretty much our week ahead. Friday is more Roller Coaster Tycoon, and then, like I said, Saturday no stream, guys, just so you know what's coming up. Dr. Madnar, thank you very much again for the subscription, and thank all you guys who sub, follow, donate, and just generally hang out on the channel. Don't ever think that if you're not subbing or donating or following, well, please follow. I mean, come on, it costs you nothing. And if you're hanging out, I really appreciate it. But, don't ever think if you're not, you know, putting money toward the stream or anything like that, that you're not welcome here or that I don't really appreciate it. The most important thing to me is that you guys hang out and chat with me and spend time with the stream and the community. So it is really my pleasure to be able to entertain you in whatever way I can, and it's incredibly flattering that you guys keep tuning in. So don't ever think that if you're not putting money towards this that it hurts me in any way. It's really important to me that you're here, and everything else is just bonus. So, but I'm not going to wax poetic all night. I'm going to go grab another handful of almonds, I think, and try to get some sleep. Actually, I think I'm going to watch them. Excuse me, I think I'm going to watch something I DVR'd for a little while, because that always puts me to sleep. I never make it through a program anymore at the end of streams. But, thanks, guys. I'm going to... Hey, Target Ray, thank you very much for the follow. If you're new to the stream, we're just wrapping up for tonight. But please do tune in pretty much every night at 1 a.m., where we will be continuing the Pawn of the Prophecy this week, and rolling right on through the Bulgariad probably for the next month. I'm going to throw a host, guys, because I'm pretty bad about doing that, so let's see who's around that we can host. Hopefully somebody that you'll enjoy. And go from there. Let me just see who's hanging that I'm following. Thanks, Target Ray. Appreciate it. Really glad to have you as part of the stream, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. I stream just about every night. I very rarely take days off, with the exception of about once every 2 weeks or so. I generally take a day off. It's been about once a week lately, but summers are tough. You guys don't want to watch Kilgore play Grand Theft Auto, do you? Let's find something interesting. I don't know what the hell game that is. Huh. Oh, it's a podcast. That's boring. Oh. Let's throw a host to Loveless Games, who's playing Battle Brothers, guys. Alright, so head on over if you don't know Loveless. I really like her streams. I'm a follower of her as well, obviously. That's how I know she's on. And say hi for me, will you?
Alt, right click. We'll get that repaired. We'll get these repaired.
Alright, guys. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
And maybe a little bit on that shield there. Oh my god. You guys are a bunch
host,
of
you can do it.
whiners. You got food for a week, and you're like, oh, I'm dying. Game Life Game is now hosting the channel! Thank you so much for the host! How are you? Tell me everything. How are you? We're playing Battle Brothers, and chat's being a bunch of whiny babies about not eating, even though they have food for a week. A week is long enough for us to all be dead. Jesus. Jeez. Get it together, chat. Heard of Forgotten Woodcutter's Home? People say it's haunted, the dead walking and all. Somewhere southeast of here. Maybe someone in Blankenstack can tell you more. Maybe. How am I? I'm good. I'm tired, but good. Actually, this is probably a good place to pause, even though you hosted. So I'll go for a little bit long since you hosted, but I'll be wrapping up here in a bit, too. I'm dying. You're not dying. Oh my god. Game Hungry Brothers? No, this is Rim Brothers. Because I asked on Twitter, should I play Rim World or Battle Brothers, and I got told by multiple people to play Rim Brothers. So this is Rim Brothers now. Coming over from Game Life Game. Well, welcome, ID Moose Man. I'm gonna call you Moosey. Give me the lion's mill. He won't know love us do the right things. What's best for business. All right, I will. His medical bills came out of your pocket, by the way. No worries, my streamers are all falling asleep. Yeah, I worked today, and then I came home and did some streaming, some Stram Banana Famine. I was just planning on killing everyone within a week. I didn't say that out loud. You can't prove that.